The neighbors said he was digging his own grave. A retired veteran in a thick red and black flannel jacket buried a pipe beneath his cabin as winter closed in. They called it useless, dangerous, a mistake that would cost him his life. But when the coldest winter in decades arrived, his cabin stayed warm while others froze. What he understood about the earth would quietly rewrite everything they thought they knew about survival. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. Winter pressed down on Duluth, Minnesota, as wind off Lake Superior scraped the streets bare and carried a cold sharp enough to feel personal. Walter Hayes woke before dawn the way he always did long after the war had ended, but never fully released him. At 68, his body was wiry rather than strong shoulders, slightly rounded from years of labor, and an old shrapnel injury that stiffened his left side when the temperature dropped. His face was deeply lined, not just with age, but with decisions, cheekbones, sharp jaw squared, a gray-streaked beard kept short and practical eyes the pale blue of winter sky before snow. He pulled on the same thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket he wore every day once October arrived. The fabric faded, but heavy, reliable in a way few things were anymore. Outside, frost bit at the wooden steps of his small cabin on the outskirts of town, where the houses thinned and the trees began to reclaim the land. Waiting for him was Bear, his German shepherd, nearly 8 years old, large and broad-chested, with a sable coat dark along the back and lighter at the chest ears, always alert. Bear had the steady presence of a sentry who had never learned how to stand down a dog, who mirrored Walter's temperament, quiet, watchful, loyal beyond explanation. Walter ate a simple breakfast, checked the weather pinned in his mind, rather than on paper, then stepped outside with a shovel slung over his shoulder. He had been digging for days now, cutting a trench through rocky soil, south of the cabin deep enough that the frost line would never touch it. Each thrust of the shovel was deliberate, paced almost meditative. Digging reminded him of foxholes and field repairs of nights when staying alive depended on understanding the ground beneath him better than the enemy did. The war had taught him one thing he never forgot: survival wasn't about force, it was about reading the environment honestly and refusing to argue with reality. The trench stretched farther each day, sloping gently upward toward the cabin. Inside it, Walter lined stone by stone, fitting them like a mason who had learned patience the hard way. When the first neighbors stopped to watch, he didn't look up. He could feel them before he heard them, the way Bear's ears flicked, the way laughter always carried differently than concern. Duluth was full of practical people, many of them descended from laborers and sailors, and they believed in solutions you could see working immediately. Doors shut, fires lit, cracks sealed. A pipe buried underground leading into the floor of a cabin offended that kind of logic. "Hey, Walt," one of them called a man named Rick Jensen, thick-necked early 50s who worked maintenance down at the docks. Rick had a loud voice and a habit of smiling even when he was being cruel, as if humor excused everything. "You planning to heat the earth now?" A couple of others laughed. Walter paused just long enough to straighten his back and rest his hands on the shovel handle. He didn't answer. He'd learned long ago that explanations given too early only hardened resistance. Bear stood beside him, unmoving amber eyes tracking the men without hostility but with unmistakable judgment. Over the next week, the trench became a topic of casual entertainment. People slowed their trucks as they passed. Someone nicknamed it the grave, and another said, Walter was just getting a head start on winter burial. None of it surprised him. After his wife died 6 winters ago, lung illness that worsened with every cold season, he had learned how quickly sympathy decayed into curiosity, then into commentary. The cabin had been too cold for her, even with the fire burning through wood faster than he could split it. He remembered the sound of wind crawling along the floorboards at night, remembered how she shivered even wrapped in blankets. That memory was what guided his shovel now, not stubbornness, not pride. By the time he began laying the hollowed pipe sections carefully sealed, sloped just enough for drainage, Sarah Miller walked up the path. Sarah lived 2 properties down a widow in her early 40s. Tall and slender, with chestnut hair, she kept tied back in a practical braid. Her face was pale, freckled, lightly across the nose, eyes, tired but observant. Life had not been gentle with her, but it hadn't hardened her either. She carried a thermos and moved with the cautious confidence of someone used to managing alone. "Walter," she said softly, stopping a few steps back, respectful of the work. "I brought you coffee." He thanked her and took a long drink, the warmth cutting through his hands. Sarah looked into the trench, worry etched into her expression. "People are talking," she said. "They think you're letting the cold in on purpose." Walter almost smiled at that. "Cold's already here," he said. "Difference is whether it rushes in angry or comes in calm." Sarah frowned, trying to follow, then shook her head. "I just don't want you freezing out here alone." He met her eyes then, and she saw something steady there, not reckless or confused. She nodded once, satisfied enough, and left him to his work. Inside the cabin, the register opening in the floor waited unfinished, a simple square framed in wood. Bear lay nearby whenever Walter worked inside, nose lifting occasionally toward the opening, as if sensing something that didn't yet exist. Walter noticed it stored the observation away. Dogs trusted what they felt, not what they were told. By early November, the trench was filled, tamped down, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Only the small screened intake far south and the floor register inside remained quiet witnesses to a decision already made. The first hard freeze came overnight. By morning, the laughter had faded into routine concern, fires lit, smoke rising thick from chimneys. Walter built his fire modestly, listening rather than watching. He felt the air move differently, subtle but present, steady rather than sharp. Bear lifted his head and settled again with a low, contented huff. Outside, Rick Jensen drove past once more and shook his head, already certain of how this story would end. Walter didn't look out the window. He had learned that winter was the only judge worth waiting for. Walter Hayes had learned long ago that real preparation was quiet work, the kind that drew no applause and invited no witnesses, and as November hardened the ground around Duluth, he continued refining what he had already set in motion rather than defending it with words. While other cabins rang with the sound of hammers and the frantic packing of moss and rags into every visible crack, Walter focused on details no one else cared to see. Inside the trench he had already buried, he revisited the stone lining, adjusting a section by hand, checking slope with nothing more than his eyes and the instincts carved into him during years of military service, where a wrong angle could mean water pooling, frost creeping, or a man not waking up at all. His movements were slow but precise, the stiffness in his left shoulder flaring briefly when he leaned too far, a reminder of a roadside blast, decades earlier, that had ended his career and quietly reshaped his temperament. Before the war, Walter had been louder, quicker to argue, certain that effort alone bent outcomes. Afterward, he became a man who listened more than he spoke, who trusted patterns and patience. Bear stayed close through it all, lying beside the floor register inside the cabin, as if guarding it, his thick fur rising and falling with steady breaths. The dog's muzzle had begun to gray around the edges, but his body remained powerful, built for endurance rather than speed, and he reacted to the cabin in ways that Walter found reassuring, choosing to sleep near the register, stretching out there with a soft grunt, as if instinctively drawn to the subtle change in air that humans barely noticed. Walter observed this without comment, the way a soldier watches weather shift before a storm, noting rather than celebrating. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind pressed itself against the walls, Walter's thoughts drifted backward, not to heroic moments, but to quiet lessons learned the hard way. He remembered a winter training exercise in northern terrain where men stronger than him had failed because they fought the cold instead of cooperating with it, piling on effort while ignoring the way heat moved, the way air stole warmth faster than muscle could replace it. He remembered an older sergeant, a man with scars along his knuckles and a voice worn thin, explaining how snow could insulate, how earth beneath frozen ground stayed stubbornly unchanged. That memory had stayed with Walter long after names and faces faded, and it had returned with sharp clarity after his wife's final winter, when he realized too late that his cabin had been breathing the cold through every gap at floor level. Now, as the nights dipped further below freezing, he tested the system in small ways, opening and closing the register, feeling with the back of his hand, listening to the way the fire responded when the air fed it gently instead of violently. The difference was subtle, but subtlety had saved lives before. Sarah Miller noticed the change before most others, not because she understood it, but because she paid attention. She visited one afternoon carrying a basket of bread, her coat cinched tight against the wind. Up close, the lines around her eyes showed exhaustion more than age, and her hands were roughened from work she had never expected to do alone. She stepped inside Walter's cabin and paused, confused by the sensation that greeted her, not warmth exactly, but the absence of that sharp edge she had grown accustomed to. "It feels steady," she said, scanning the corners instinctively. Walter nodded. "That's the idea." She followed his gaze to Bear, who lifted his head briefly, tail thumping once against the floor before settling again. Sarah crouched to scratch the dog's neck, smiling faintly. "He seems to like it," she said. Walter allowed himself a quiet, humorless chuckle. "He knows before I do." Sarah straightened and hesitated, worry returning. "Rick says you'll regret this when January hits," she added, apologetic but honest. Walter met her concern without irritation. "Rick believes what he's always seen," he replied. "So did I once." Sarah studied him for a moment longer, seeing not stubbornness but something steadier, and she let the subject drop. Outside, the settlement moved into full winter posture. Snow arrived in heavy wind-driven sheets and chimneys worked overtime. Rick Jensen grew louder in his predictions, turning certainty into entertainment, at the expense of the quiet veteran at the edge of town. Another man joined the chorus, Tom Bradley, a carpenter in his late 50s, tall and lean, with a long face and a beard he kept full out of habit more than style. Tom had built most of the older cabins around Duluth and carried himself with the confidence of a man whose methods had never been publicly questioned. He stopped by one afternoon, boots stamping snow, from the porch, eyes sharp with curiosity rather than cruelty. "You really think dirt's going to save you fuel?" he asked, not unkindly. Walter explained only what was necessary, keeping his words simple, grounding them in experience rather than theory. Tom listened, arms crossed, nodding occasionally, then shook his head. "I've seen a lot of winters," he said. "Air's air. Cold's cold." Walter didn't argue. He had learned that conviction rarely yielded to explanation before evidence arrived. As December settled in, the system worked quietly, almost invisibly, which made it easy for skeptics to dismiss. Walter burned less wood without announcing it. He slept through the night without feeding the fire every few hours. Bear sprawled on the floor near the register, belly exposed, snoring softly, a picture of unearned comfort that would have drawn comment if anyone had been watching closely. Walter noted the way the cabin temperature held the way drafts failed to materialize, and he felt a cautious relief settle into him, not triumph, but confirmation. He did not yet allow himself to believe winter had been answered. He knew better than to trust early success. Winter, like war, revealed its true character slowly and often cruelly. On the last night before Christmas, a storm rolled in that rattled the windows and drove the temperature down hard and fast. Walter stood by the window watching snow erase the path he had walked so many times, and felt the old familiar tightening in his chest that came before nights of waiting. Bear rose and pressed against his leg, steady present. Walter rested a hand on the dog's head and breathed, feeling the cabin remain calm around them. Somewhere in town, someone was laughing about the buried pipe again, but the sound couldn't reach this far, and even if it could, it would have no power here. The lesson of the ground of patience, of understanding, rather than force, had already taken root. Winter had not yet delivered its verdict, but Walter sensed for the first time in years that he was no longer bracing blindly against it. January arrived without ceremony, slipping into Duluth like an occupying force that had no interest in negotiation, and within 48 hours, the temperature dropped so sharply it felt as if the city itself had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. The radio voices called it an Arctic surge, but Walter Hayes didn't need terminology to recognize what was coming. He felt it in his joints first, the old injury in his shoulder tightening like a warning wire, then, in the way Bear refused to stray far from the cabin door posture, low and attentive, as if the cold itself were something that could cross a boundary if given permission. By the third morning, the mercury had fallen well below -25°C, and it stayed there day and night unmoving, indifferent to effort or optimism. Smoke thickened above the neighborhood as fires were fed harder and harder, and the sound of splitting wood echoed long after sunset, men working by lantern light, because stopping felt more dangerous than exhaustion. Rick Jensen's cabin was among the first to show strain. Rick had always trusted force, bigger fire, more wood, louder certainty, and now that instinct betrayed him. He was a broad man with a barrel chest and a face permanently reddened by wind and drink, but even his confidence dulled as the cold settled into his floorboards. Drafts slipped in through places he had never noticed, invisible currents that crawled along the ground and wrapped around ankles and calves. His wife moved the children closer to the fireplace each night, rearranging furniture until the room became a tight cluster of bodies and blankets. Frost feathered the inside corners of the windows, and condensation froze along the lower logs, forming thin white veins that crept upward as if claiming territory. Rick joked about it during the day, but by the fourth night, his laughter sounded brittle, a performance meant to keep panic from finding a foothold. 2 houses down Sarah Miller's cabin fared little better. Built years earlier by her husband, who had died suddenly of a stroke, the winter before it had always been drafty, but never like this. Sarah was tall and narrow-shouldered, her height making her seem stronger than she felt, her skin pale against the dark wool scarves she wrapped around her neck. As the cold deepened, she slept fully clothed. Her chestnut braid loosened, so it wouldn't pull painfully when she turned in her sleep. Her children shared her bed, now their small bodies pressed close, breath puffing in the air, even with the fire roaring. On the third night of the freeze, she burned a chair, then a small side table, the wood cracking loudly, as if protesting the decision. Each piece she fed the fire felt like an admission of failure, not just of construction, but of protection. She told herself it would be enough that the cold had to break soon, because the alternative was too frightening to consider. Across the street, Tom Bradley fought the cold with methodical determination. He had built his cabin with care, or so he believed, and his pride in that work made the suffering feel personal. Tom was lean, his long beard now rimed with ice whenever he stepped outside, his eyes sharp even when fatigue dragged at his posture. He measured his firewood consumption, obsessively stacking and restacking, calculating how many days he could sustain this pace. Still, the far corners of his cabin hovered just above freezing, and his wife woke with frost clinging to her hair, one morning, breath shallow and panicked. Tom said nothing then, but something in his certainty cracked just enough to let doubt slip in. And then there was Walter's cabin. The difference was not dramatic in appearance, no blazing inferno, no frantic movement, but an atmosphere. Inside, the air remained calm, almost neutral, as if the cold outside were a rumor rather than a presence. Walter fed the fire sparingly, letting it burn steady rather than furious, and the warmth held spreading evenly instead of collapsing inward toward the hearth. The floor, often the coldest place in any winter cabin, remained tolerable, free of that sharp bite that climbed into bones. Bear slept stretched along the boards near the register belly, exposed in unconscious trust, occasionally shifting to follow the warmest pocket of air. Walter noticed the dog's ease and felt something loosen in his chest, a knot he hadn't realized he was carrying. On the fourth night of the freeze, when the wind howled hard enough to rattle loose shutters and drive snow sideways, Walter woke briefly to silence. The fire had burned down to coals glowing faintly, but the cabin had not surrendered its heat. He lay still, listening to the subtle movement of air through the system he had buried months earlier, and for a moment the memory of a winter night overseas surfaced unbidden. A patrol huddled in a shallow depression, men surviving not because they were stronger than the cold, but because they had learned how to let the land shield them. That memory carried no heroics, only relief, and Walter drifted back to sleep with the same feeling. By the fifth day, word spread quietly, carried not by rumor but by observation. People noticed Walter's chimney first. While others belched thick smoke, his released a thin, steady plume, the sign of a fire working efficiently rather than desperately. Tom Bradley saw it while hauling yet another armload of wood inside, and stopped in the yard, breath fogging heavily as he stared. Something about that chimney disturbed him more than any explanation could have. He stood there longer than necessary, cold seeping through his boots, until logic forced him back indoors. That evening he told his wife he was going to check on Walter, his voice carefully neutral. Rick Jensen followed a different path to the same realization. On the sixth night, after waking to find ice creeping across the interior wall near his daughter's bed, he pulled on his coat and stepped outside. Anger finally outweighing embarrassment. He trudged through knee-deep snow toward Walter's place, Bear's bark announcing his approach long before he reached the porch. Inside, Rick was struck silent. The air felt like late autumn rather than deep winter, cool but forgiving. His shoulders slumped almost immediately, the bravado draining from him as heat reached places that had been numb for days. "What the hell did you do?" he asked, not accusing now, just exhausted. Walter showed him the register, the slow, steady draw of air, explaining in plain terms without triumph. Rick nodded, rubbing his hands, pride set aside by necessity. Sarah came the next morning, eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep movements, careful as if conserving energy. When she stepped inside, she stopped short, one hand pressed to her mouth. Tears followed, silent and sudden, not from sadness alone, but from relief sharpened by comparison. Walter said nothing, offering her a chair and a mug of hot water. She sat breathing, letting warmth do what words could not. Bear rested his head on her knee, sensing something fragile had entered the room. The cold finally began to ease on the seventh day, retreating slowly, reluctantly. Duluth emerged battered but intact, counting losses in burned furniture, depleted woodpiles, and shaken certainty. Walter did not celebrate. He simply continued as he had, knowing the lesson had been delivered more effectively than any argument. The buried pipe had done its work quietly, patiently, and winter had spoken in a language no one could ignore. Tom Bradley did not come to Walter Hayes's cabin with curiosity at first. He came with exhaustion. It showed in the way his shoulders sagged beneath his heavy wool coat, in the frost clinging unevenly to his beard, in the deep creases around his eyes, that no amount of pride could smooth away. Tom was a man shaped by repetition and reputation. In his late 50s, tall and narrow-hipped with long arms that spoke of decades swinging hammers and lifting beams, he had built more cabins than anyone else in that part of Duluth. His hands were scarred and thick knuckles, permanently swollen nails split and ridged from cold seasons spent working barehanded when gloves slowed him down. For most of his life, Tom's certainty had been earned honestly. What he built usually worked. What he dismissed usually failed. That certainty had hardened into identity, and identities do not crack easily. He knocked once firm but not loud, and when Walter opened the door, a wave of warmer air reached Tom's face. He froze not from cold, but from surprise, his breath catching, as sensation returned to fingers he had barely felt in days. Walter stepped aside without comment, letting him enter. Inside, the difference announced itself immediately, not in dramatic heat, but in the absence of suffering. The cabin felt balanced. The warmth did not cling to the ceiling or huddle near the fireplace. It occupied the room, evenly settling into corners Tom instinctively scanned for cold. His eyes tracked the walls, the floor, the seams where logs met. Nothing glittered with frost. No drafts stirred dust or ash. Tom removed his gloves, slowly flexing his hands as pain bloomed and receded. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered more to himself than to Walter. His voice, usually firm and instructive, sounded thin. Walter poured him a cup of hot water and gestured toward the floor register. Bear, who had risen briefly at the knock, now lay back down nearby, his large body stretched comfortably, eyes half closed. Tom noticed the dog too, the way animals always noticed first. A working man trusted dogs more than words. Walter did not begin with theory. He never did. He opened the door and waved Tom outside again into the sharp bite of January air. Snow crunched underfoot as they walked to the southern edge of the property where the intake sat beneath a simple wooden hood. Walter knelt with a grunt, motioning Tom closer. "Put your hand there," he said. Tom did. The air rushing in was brutal, clean, punishingly cold. Tom nodded sharply as if to say, "See, there it is." Then Walter stood and led him back inside, closing the door behind them. He guided Tom's hand to the register in the floor. The air there was unmistakably warmer, not hot, but gentle, calm. Tom inhaled sharply and pulled his hand back as if burned, then tried again, slower this time. The realization landed not all at once, but in stages, each one unsettling. Tom straightened, running a hand through his beard. "You're not blocking air," he said finally. "You're changing it." The words sounded strange coming from his mouth, as if they belonged to someone else. Walter nodded once. He explained the depth, the slope, the length, his voice even careful not to frame it as correction. He spoke the way he had learned to speak to younger soldiers after the war, clear, respectful, grounded in observation. Tom listened, truly listened, and that alone marked a shift more dramatic than any argument. Over the next 2 days, others came. Not in groups, not loudly, but one at a time, each carrying their own version of doubt and desperation. Rick Jensen arrived again, quieter now. His broad shoulders slumped, face drawn from sleepless nights. He smelled faintly of smoke and damp wool. Rick had always relied on force and humor, and without either he looked smaller, older. He listened with furrowed brow, asking blunt questions, rubbing his hands together as warmth returned. He did not apologize. He did not need to. His presence was admission enough. Sarah Miller came again as well, this time standing straighter, though the exhaustion still clung to her like an extra layer. In the warmer light of Walter's cabin, the details of her face became clearer. The fine lines at the corners of her mouth, from years of worry, the determination set into her jaw. She watched closely, absorbing every word, already translating what she saw into calculations about distant soil effort. When Walter mentioned slope and drainage, she nodded, eyes focused the way she had learned to focus after losing her husband, when listening carefully became a survival skill. A new face appeared on the third day, Henry Kowalski, a retired dock worker in his early 60s, shorter than Walter, but broader through the middle, with a thick mustache yellowed slightly by years of tobacco. Henry had lived through enough hard winters to respect outcomes more than explanations. He ran a rough hand over the register, grunted, and said, "Damn," with a mixture of awe and irritation. All those years, that was all. He didn't need more. The conversations that followed were different from any Walter had known before. They were quieter, slower, filled with pauses. Men who were used to instructing now asked. They asked about depth, about distance, about what happened if soil was rocky or clay-heavy. Walter answered what he could and admitted what he didn't know. That honesty, more than the warmth, disarmed them. Tom Bradley returned, twice notebook in hand, the second time his long fingers clumsy around the pencil. Pride had not vanished from him, but it had shifted, redirecting itself toward understanding rather than defense. He asked about ratios, about airflow, about condensation. When Walter explained the slope and the way moisture drained back toward the intake, Tom closed his eyes briefly, as if seeing past mistakes rearrange themselves into lessons. Word spread beyond Walter's property, now not as ridicule, but as something closer to cautionary respect. The tone changed at the trading post, where jokes about the buried pipe lost their edge and eventually faded altogether. Instead, conversations bent toward what had been missed, what had been assumed. Certainty, once comfortable, now felt expensive. Walter did not feel vindicated. What he felt was relief edged with sadness. Relief that the system worked, that winter had not taken more than it already had. Sadness that it had taken suffering to loosen minds that might have opened sooner. He watched Bear sleep, chest rising steadily, and thought of how many winters he had spent fighting instead of listening. The earth, patient and unchanged, had been offering the same lesson all along. As February crept closer and the worst of the cold eased, Walter knew the story had shifted. It was no longer about whether he would survive the winter. It was about whether others would let go of what they thought they knew long enough to learn something new. The cracks in certainty were there now, spreading quietly, just like warmth rising through a buried pipe, unstoppable once it began. By the time February loosened its grip on Duluth, and the snowbanks began to slump under their own weight, the town was no longer quite the same place it had been before the buried pipe. The cold had retreated reluctantly, leaving behind scorched hearthstones, shortened woodpiles, and a quiet accounting that took place behind closed doors. People spoke less about what winter had taken and more about what it had revealed. On clear mornings, the sound of shovels striking frozen ground echoed again, not in Walter Hayes's yard this time, but across the edges of the settlement, where men and women measured distances, argued over angles, and learned often painfully that the earth did not reward shortcuts. Walter moved among them without ceremony. He was still the same spare, gray-bearded veteran in the thick red and black flannel jacket, his posture slightly bent, his steps deliberate. Bear followed at his heel, older now, in the way winter ages animals too, his muzzle dusted with more gray, his movements slower but still purposeful. Where Walter stopped, Bear stopped. Where Walter knelt to trace a line in the dirt with a gloved finger, Bear sat watching, as if guarding the knowledge itself. Walter did not take money for his help. When Rick Jensen tried to press folded bills into his hand one afternoon, Walter closed Rick's fingers back around them gently and shook his head. "Spend it on wood," he said, "or don't need to." Rick laughed, then a short sound, embarrassed but relieved. Some of the new systems worked well. Tom Bradley's, for instance, was a careful success. Tom approached the work with the humility of a man who had been corrected by reality and survived the experience. He dug deeper than he thought necessary, measured slope with a craftsman's eye, sharpened by regret, and lined his trench meticulously. His cabin the following winter did not achieve Walter's effortless stability, but it came close enough to change how Tom spoke at the trading post. Gone was the voice of absolute certainty. In its place was something steadier, quieter. When younger builders asked him why he had changed his methods, Tom would pause, beard lifting slightly in the wind, and say, "Because the ground doesn't care how many cabins I've built." Others fared less well. Henry Kowalski, practical but impatient, buried his intake too shallow, unwilling to dig through a particularly stubborn layer of clay. His system helped on mild days but failed when the real cold returned, and Henry accepted the outcome with a grim nod, already planning how to do it properly next time. Two brothers on the north edge of town cut their pipe length short to save effort only to when the air barely moderated, the benefit minimal. These failures did not discourage the town. They instructed it. Duluth learned, as communities often do not, through theory but through comparison. Sarah Miller's project became something of a quiet landmark. She hired help, choosing men not for speed, but for patience, and insisted on doing parts of the work herself despite blistered hands and aching shoulders. Up close, her determination transformed her slender frame, made her seem taller, stronger. Her chestnut hair was usually bound tight now, her pale skin weathered further by spring sun and wind. When her system was finished, she tested it cautiously, almost fearfully, as if afraid hope itself might invite disappointment. But when the next winter came, her children slept warm without burning furniture, and Sarah's relief showed not in celebration, but in posture, her shoulders finally lowering, her breath, easing the tension she had carried since her husband's death, releasing little by little. Walter watched all of this with a sense of distance that surprised even him. He had not intended to start anything. He had only wanted to survive another winter without fighting it. Yet here, the town was altered by a lesson that had been waiting beneath their feet all along. In quiet moments, he wondered how many other truths lay buried under assumptions ignored until necessity forced them into daylight. The thought unsettled him, not because it felt new, but because it felt familiar. War had taught him the same thing in harsher ways. Years later, far beyond the winter that had made Walter's cabin a place of pilgrimage, the town would modernize. Electric lines would arrive. Oil furnaces would replace wood stoves. Thermostats would offer the illusion of control with the turn of a dial. The buried pipes would be forgotten one by one, their inlets covered, their registers sealed beneath new flooring. Convenience would win, as it often did. But the lesson did not vanish completely. It lingered in conversations, in marginal notes, in the memory of an old veteran who had trusted the ground more than common sense. Walter did not live to see the rediscovery. He died quietly in his sleep years later. Bear curled at the foot of the bed, the cabin warm and still. When the house was eventually dismantled, the workers found the pipe and argued over what it had been, for some dismissive, others curious. No one thought to ask the earth, which remained unchanged, holding its steady temperature, patient as ever. For those who had lived through that winter, the meaning endured, not as a technical achievement, but as a reminder. Knowledge did not belong exclusively to the loudest voice or the longest resume. Sometimes it belonged to a quiet man, digging alone, guided by memory, humility, and an understanding that nature was not an enemy to defeat, but a partner to respect. The pipe had been buried, mocked, tested, and proven. The wisdom beneath it followed the same path. Sometimes the miracle is not a sudden flame from the sky, but a quiet truth placed beneath our feet long before we ever thought to look down. God does not always shout. Often he whispers through the earth, through patience, through laws of creation that keep working whether we believe in them or not. Walter did not create warmth, he simply trusted that God had already placed it there, steady and faithful, waiting to be understood. In our own lives, we face winters too. Seasons of fear, doubt, loss, and exhaustion. And like Walter's neighbors, we often fight harder instead of listening deeper. We burn ourselves out, thinking strength alone will save us, forgetting that God designed this world with quiet supports meant to carry us if we choose humility over pride. The lesson is simple, but not easy. Before judging, pause. Before mocking, observe. Before dismissing, listen. Because sometimes the person you call foolish is simply walking closer to God's design than you are. If this story spoke to you, share it with someone who might need hope during their own winter. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We read everyone. And if you believe there is wisdom hidden in ordinary places, consider subscribing to the channel so we can continue uncovering stories like this together. May God bless you, protect your home, warm your heart, and guide your steps no matter how cold the season you're walking through.